Join Dad Arthur, Mom Ellie, their children Max, Lily, and magical dog Barley as they cross into the Garden of Eternal Dreams to help a weary gardener save the world's dreams. The Dream Gardener and the Shadow of Failure. Part 1. The Garden of Fading Hopes. The Wander-Wagon did not travel on a road of stone or dirt today. For miles, the magical map had been behaving strangely, its ink swirling in lazy lavender spirals rather than sharp topographical lines. The parchment felt warm to the touch, smelling faintly of jasmine and old books. Following the map's silent command, Arthur steered the van through a veil of thick, iridescent mist that tasted like sugar and starlight. When they emerged on the other side, the wheels of the wagon were no longer spinning on gravel. They were rolling silently across a carpet of emerald moss that seemed to glow from within. "We aren't in the Iron Mountains anymore," Max whispered, pressing his nose against the cool glass of the window. Outside, the world was a masterpiece of the impossible. They had entered the Garden of Eternal Dreams. Islands of Earth floated in a sky the color of a bruised plum, connected by bridges of woven ivy and solidified moonlight. Giant poppies, the size of beach umbrellas, swayed in a wind that made no sound, their petals shedding a soft, luminous dust. Every few seconds, a translucent bubble would drift past the van. Within these spheres, one could see flickering images. A child flying on a paper bird, a feast of golden cakes, a forest made of candy. "These are dreams," Ellie realized, her voice hushed with awe. "The map didn't bring us to a place. It brought us to an idea." Barley, usually the first to jump out of the van, was acting peculiar. He sat by the sliding door, his tail thumping rhythmically, but his eyes were half closed. He was dream-scenting, his nose twitching as he caught the aroma of 1,000 different imaginations. As the family stepped out of the Wander-Wagon, the beauty of the garden began to falter. The further they walked, the more they noticed a creeping decay. On the edges of the floating islands, the vibrant flowers were being strangled by jagged, ink-black vines. These vines were covered in thorns that pulsed with a sickly violet light. Where they touched the dream bubbles, the images inside turned gray and vanished. In the center of the largest island stood a young man, slumped against the trunk of a silver willow. He wore a cloak made of shimmering petals that were now wilting and turning to ash at the edges. His hair was the color of twilight, and his eyes held a weariness that looked as though it had lasted for centuries. This was Celestian, the dream gardener. "You shouldn't be here," Celestian said, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. He didn't look up as the wheelers approached. "This garden is falling to the Blight. The nightmares have grown too strong. They are no longer just shadows under the bed. They are weeds rooted deep in the hearts of the dreamers." "We saw the vines," Arthur said, stepping forward. "My family. We've seen darkness before. We've brought back the stars. Maybe we can help you weed your garden." Celestian finally raised his head, a flicker of desperate hope crossing his tired features. "You do not understand. To pull a nightmare weed, one cannot simply cut the vine. You must enter the dream it has infected. You must face the fear from the inside. But if you fail, if the dreamer rejects you, or if the fear consumes you, you will never wake up. You will become part of the gray mist forever." Max, ever the explorer, had wandered a few paces away toward a particularly gnarled plant. It looked like a rose bush, but its buds were charred black and hissed like tiny snakes. "Is this one of them?" Max asked, reaching out a hand. "Max, wait!" Ellie cried, but it was too late. As Max's finger brushed a jagged thorn, the bud erupted. Instead of pollen, it released a thick, oily cloud of black smoke that swirled around him instantly. Instinctively, Arthur and Ellie lunged forward to pull him away, and Barley leapt into the fray, barking at the darkness. The smoke didn't vanish. It expanded, swallowing the entire family and their faithful dog. The ground beneath their feet seemed to dissolve. The sweet smell of the garden was replaced by the sharp, metallic scent of pencil lead and the stale air of a closed room. For a moment, there was a sensation of falling through cold water. Then, the world solidified. They were no longer in the Garden of Dreams. They were standing in a hallway that stretched on for miles. The walls were made of towering stacks of wooden desks, and the floor was a giant sheet of graph paper. The air felt heavy, vibrating with a low, humming anxiety that made Max's stomach turn. In the distance, they saw a small, flickering light. It was a young girl, perhaps 8 years old, sitting at a tiny desk in the middle of the vast, empty hallway. This was Mira. Above her, the ceiling didn't exist. Instead, there was a swirling vortex of black ink, and from that ink, a creature was beginning to descend. A shapeless body with tentacles like an octopus, but its body was made of crumpled, failed test papers and broken pens. This was the shadow of failure. "Remember," Celestian's voice echoed in their minds, faint and distant as a fading memory. "Do not break the dream. You must become part of her story, or the nightmare will claim you all. Save the dreamer, and the weed will wither." Max looked at his hands and gasped. His bright red jacket had turned into a dull school blazer. Arthur was suddenly holding a giant wooden ruler, and Ellie's bag was filled with glowing silver erasers. Barley gave a soft woof, looking down at his own fur. He was wearing a small, scholarly bow tie. They were inside the nightmare now. The first battle for the Garden of Dreams had begun. The Dream Gardener and the Shadow of Failure, Part 2. The Classroom of Crooked Shadows. The hallway was not a place of movement, but of stagnation. Every step Max took felt like walking through thick honey. The floor, a vast expanse of graph paper, began to shift, the blue lines rising up like prison bars. Ahead of them, the little girl named Mira sat huddled over her desk. She was frantically scratching a pencil against a paper that seemed to absorb the lead without leaving a mark. The shadow of failure descended further from the inky vortex above. "Not good enough," the shadow hissed, its voice echoing with the harsh tone of 1,000 disappointed whispers. "Look at the smudge on the margin. Look at the shaky line. You'll never finish, Mira. And even if you do, it will be wrong." Mira's shoulders shook. A single tear fell onto her paper, and where it landed, a hole burned through the page, revealing a dark abyss beneath her desk. "We have to do something," Ellie whispered, her voice tight. She felt the weight of her bag. The silver erasers within were humming, vibrating with a gentle light. "But remember what Celestian said. We can't attack it. We have to change the dream." Arthur looked at the giant wooden ruler in his hand. He noticed that as Mira's fear grew, the ruler became heavier, turning into a leaden weight. "We aren't warriors here," Arthur realized, his eyes narrowing. "We're support. We need to show her that the marks on the paper aren't her enemies." They began to move, not as intruders, but as part of the scenery. Max, in his dull school blazer, sat at a desk that materialized beside Mira. He didn't look at the monster. He looked at his own blank page. "I hate long divisions," Max said aloud, his voice steady. The shadow froze, its eyes, represented by circles, turning toward him. "Every time I do them, I get a different answer. It's kind of funny how many ways I can be wrong." The shadow let out a low growl, its ink body bristling. "Wrong is failure. Failure is the end." "No," Ellie said, stepping forward. She reached into her bag and pulled out a silver eraser. She didn't rub out Mira's work. Instead, she touched the dark, burning hole in the paper. The silver light flowed into the abyss, turning the hole into a shimmering, reflective pool. An eraser isn't for hiding mistakes. It's a tool for second chances. Mira looked up, her eyes wide and watery. She saw Ellie, who looked like a kind librarian from a storybook, and Arthur, who stood like a sturdy architect behind them. The shadow shrieked, its form swelling. The ink from the ceiling began to rain down, turning into heavy, black droplets that tried to pin Mira to her chair. She must be perfect. If she is not perfect, she is nothing. The creature lunged, its sharp, lead-tipped legs stabbing toward Mira's desk. But before it could strike, Barley acted. The golden retriever, wearing his scholarly bow tie, didn't growl or bite. He trotted over to the shadow and, with a playful wag of his tail, sat right on its spindly foot. The shadow recoiled. It was a creature of sharp edges and cold judgment. It didn't know how to handle the soft, warm weight of a dog who just wanted to play. Barley looked up at the monster and let out a bright, cheerful bark. Then he did something only Barley could do. He nudged a black ink pot with his nose, spilling it across the graph paper. "Look, Mira!" Max cried, pointing at the spill. "It looks like a cloud! Or maybe a dragon!" Mira stared at the mess. She saw the ink, the silver light from Ellie's eraser, and the dog who was now trying to catch the raindrops of ink in his mouth. For the first time, the paralyzing tension in her chest eased. She picked up a blue crayon that had been lying forgotten on the floor. It's a whale," Mira whispered. She drew a quick, shaky tail on the edge of the ink splat. The shadow of failure shuddered. Its red ink mask began to blur. The more Mira engaged with the mistake, the less power the monster held. The classroom began to tremble, the walls of desks leaning inward as the nightmare fought to maintain its grip. "You are failing!" the shadow screamed, its voice cracking. "You are playing when you should be working." "We're doing both," Max replied, grinning as he drew a tiny pirate ship next to Mira's whale. The air began to smell of ozone and fresh paper. The silver light from the erasers grew brighter, pushing back the inky vortex. But the shadow was not finished yet. It gathered its strength for one final, desperate scream, turning the entire room into a whirlwind of sharp, flying papers. They had to hold on. If Mira lost her focus now, the dream would collapse, and the weed in the garden would win. Part 3. The Flight of the Paper Planes. The whirlwind of papers grew into a deafening roar. Thousands of blank sheets, marked with red X's and harsh corrections, circled the room like the blades of a jagged storm. The shadow of failure had abandoned its spindly form, melting into a colossal, ink-stained cyclone that threatened to tear the very floor from beneath Mira's feet. "Give up!" the storm howled. "The more you try, the more you have to lose. Stay in the dark, where you can never be wrong." Mira shrank back, her blue crayon trembling in her hand. The courage she had found was flickering like a candle in a gale. But Max stepped into the center of the wind, his blazer fluttering wildly. He reached out and caught one of the flying papers. Instead of crumbling it, he began to fold it with practiced, steady fingers. "A mistake is only a weight if you let it sit still," Max shouted over the roar. "But if you change its shape, it can catch the wind." With a final tuck, Max held up a perfectly creased paper plane. He handed it to Mira. She looked at the red marks on the paper, the very marks she had feared, and saw them now as racing stripes on the wings of an aircraft. Following Max's lead, Arthur and Ellie began to grab the swirling sheets of doubt. Arthur used his iron ruler to create sharp, aerodynamic folds, while Ellie's silver erasers touched the wings, leaving trails of glowing starlight. "Transform it, Mira," Ellie encouraged. "Don't hide the mistakes. Make them fly." Mira's eyes brightened. She began to fold. Her hands, once shaky, moved with a new, frantic purpose. She turned a stained math quiz into a glider. She turned a messy essay into a dart. Beside her, Barley was jumping into the air, catching the darkest papers and bringing them to the family to be refolded. "Now," Arthur commanded. "Together!" They launched the planes. Hundreds of paper gliders, glowing with silver and blue light, soared into the heart of the ink storm. They didn't cut through the darkness. They filled it. The shadow of failure tried to swat them down, but the planes were too light, too nimble. They danced around the ink tentacles, their starlight trails weaving a net of bright, defiant hope. As the planes struck the vortex, the ink didn't splash. It began to brighten. The red marks of failure turned into golden sparks. The storm slowed, the roar fading into the gentle rustle of falling leaves. Mira stood tall now, no longer a victim of the dream, but its master. She threw her final plane, the one made from the whale drawing, and as it hit the mask of the shadow, the monster shattered. It didn't explode in violence. It simply dissolved into a cloud of colorful confetti and shimmering bubbles. The gray classroom walls melted away. The ceiling of ink vanished, replaced by a sky of soft, morning gold. The giant hallway of desks transformed into a vast, sun-drenched meadow where every blade of grass was a different color of the rainbow. Mira stood in the center, her school blazer replaced by a bright yellow dress. She looked at the Wheelers and Barley, a wide, peaceful smile on her face. I think I'll try again tomorrow," Mira whispered. "And if I fail, I'll just make a better plane." She faded slowly, her dream bubble drifting upward toward the higher reaches of the garden. With a sudden, sharp intake of breath, the Wheelers and Barley snapped back. One moment they were in the meadow, and the next they were standing back in the garden of eternal dreams. The metallic smell of lead was gone, replaced by the intoxicating scent of blooming jasmine. In front of them, the gnarled, blackened bush that Max had touched was gone. In its place grew a magnificent flower with petals that looked like folded paper, shimmering with a pearlescent light. This was the bloom of confidence. Celestian, the dream gardener, stood nearby. He looked stronger, the ash on his cloak replaced by a soft, healthy green glow. He bowed deeply to the family. "You have done the impossible," Celestian said, his voice now a melodious chime. "You didn't just destroy the weed, you healed the root. Mira will wake up tomorrow with the strength to face her challenges. You have saved a dreamer." "There are many more weeds, aren't there?" Arthur asked, looking toward the dark vines on the distant islands. "There are," Celestian admitted. "The garden is vast, and the fears are many. But for the first time in an age, the air feels lighter." Barley trotted over to the new flower and gave it a gentle, inquisitive sniff. He let out a small, satisfied sneeze. Not a magical this time. Their mission in the world of dreams had only just begun, but as the Wheelers looked at the restored beauty around them, they knew they were ready for the next weed in the garden. "Rest for a moment," Celestian invited, gesturing to a grove of silver willows. "For tonight, the dreams are sweet." The Wander-Wagon sat nearby on the glowing moss, its headlights reflecting the soft light of 1,000 happy dreams. The first battle was won. And so the first weed is pulled. Through the eyes of a child, the Wheelers discovered that a mistake is not a cage, but the first fold of a paper wing. Mira will wake up today with a lighter heart, and the bloom of confidence now shines in Celestian's garden. But do not let the golden morning fool you. The Garden of Dreams is vast, and deeper fears still linger in the mist. Our journey has only just begun, and the labyrinth of abandonment is already calling from the shadows. Until we meet again in the stacks of the mystical library, remember, even the darkest nightmare can be transformed into a beautiful dream. Sleep well, and keep your heart wide open.